A wealthy billionaire, known for his strict routines and distant personality, never imagined his carefully controlled world would shift on Christmas Eve. For years, he believed that money, luxury, and strict discipline were enough to provide everything his family needed. But everything changed when he walked through his mansion and unexpectedly saw his new maid quietly giving leftover food to his young son. The boy, who rarely smiled or spoke, accepted the simple meal with a gentle look that revealed how much kindness meant to him. The billionaire froze, confused by what he saw. He had never noticed how lonely his son seemed, nor how naturally the maid cared for him. That single moment made him question everything he thought he understood about parenting, family, and responsibility. What he chose to do afterwards surprised not only the maid, but everyone around him. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Ethan walked slowly through the large mansion, moving from one empty room to another, trying to understand why Christmas never felt special for him. The house was full of lights, decorations, and expensive ornaments, but none of it made him feel better. He was only 7, yet he already carried a sadness that he could not explain. He barely ate, pushing away most of the food placed in front of him, and no one seemed to notice or ask why. He felt weak, not because his body was tired, but because his heart felt too heavy. He often stopped in the hallway, looking out the big windows, as if hoping someone would appear and talk to him. But the house stayed quiet. Even with all the luxury around him, the silence made him feel small and forgotten. Christmas music played softly somewhere in the house, but he did not feel any joy listening to it. Instead, it reminded him of everything he wished he had, but didn't. He wished for something simple, like a hug or a warm conversation. He wished someone would look at him and truly see him. But year after year, the feeling of loneliness only grew stronger. Richard Miller arrived home late again, just as he did almost every night. He came in talking on the phone, walking quickly through the entrance, focused only on his business. His voice echoed through the living room as he discussed numbers, meetings, and contracts, not noticing Ethan standing nearby. Ethan watched his father walk past him without saying a single word. It had become normal for him. Richard never asked how he felt, never asked what he wanted for Christmas, and never spent time with him. While other children talked about playing with their fathers or going to fun places, Ethan's memories were filled with empty evenings and unanswered hopes. He often wondered if his father even remembered his age. The mansion, though filled with expensive things, felt like a place built for adults, not for a child looking for affection. Ethan wished his father would look at him, smile, or even say something simple like, "How was your day?" But Richard always rushed away, disappearing into his office or leaving again for another meeting. Each time he passed Ethan without noticing him, the boy felt the distance grow bigger, like a wall he could never climb. Vanessa Miller spent most of her time planning trips, attending parties, and visiting friends. She enjoyed traveling to different places and dressing beautifully for events, always thinking about the next thing she wanted to do. At home, she walked past Ethan just like Richard did, barely stopping long enough to offer him a quick smile that didn't feel real. When she was present, she was usually distracted by her phone or her schedule. She never sat with him to talk or listen. She never asked why he refused to eat or why he seemed sad. She simply assumed everything was fine. Ethan watched her leave the house often, wearing expensive clothes and carrying designer bags, always rushing to another activity. He sometimes tried to approach her, hoping she would notice him, but she always said she was in a hurry. He felt like he was someone she cared about only from far away, not someone she truly wanted near her. During Christmas, when other families spent time together, Vanessa was busy deciding where she wanted to celebrate, or what she wanted to post on social media. Ethan wished she would sit beside him, touch his hair, or tell him something comforting, but every moment with her felt distant and cold. At school, the difference between Ethan and the other children became even clearer. During class conversations, many kids spoke excitedly about their parents. They shared stories about fun weekends, family dinners, and holiday traditions. Ethan listened quietly, keeping his eyes on his desk, pretending he was not bothered by their words. He never joined the conversation because he had nothing to share. Whenever the teacher encouraged the students to talk about their families, Ethan stayed silent. His classmates sometimes asked why he didn't speak, but he simply shrugged. He didn't know how to explain the loneliness he felt at home. He also didn't want anyone to feel sorry for him. At recess, he sat alone on a bench, watching the other children play. He wanted to join them, but he didn't feel like he belonged. The thought of talking about his parents made him uncomfortable, and he tried to avoid it as much as he could. When the other kids talked about Christmas plans, he felt his chest tighten. He knew he would spend the holiday in the same cold mansion, walking through the same halls, waiting for affection that would never come. School only reminded him of everything he was missing. That Christmas, despite the decorations shining brightly throughout the house, Ethan felt the same emptiness he felt every year. The living room had a tall Christmas tree covered in perfect ornaments chosen by decorators, not by family members. The gifts under it looked expensive, but Ethan knew none of them would make him feel better. He didn't care about toys or electronics if he didn't have anyone to share them with. The smell of food came from the kitchen, but he had no appetite. He walked slowly from room to room, touching the furniture lightly as he passed, wishing he could feel connected to something or someone. The mansion seemed larger during the holidays, as if the wide spaces made his loneliness louder. He sometimes sat on the stairs, hugging his knees, listening for footsteps that never came. The lights blinked gently around him, but he didn't feel any warmth from them. He wondered what Christmas felt like for children who had loving families. He imagined them laughing, talking, opening presents together, and he wished he could experience that even once. But in the Miller mansion, Christmas was just another day filled with silence. Even though Ethan tried to stay strong, the loneliness around him felt heavier than before. He thought about how different his life could be if his parents paid attention to him. He imagined simple things, like having dinner together or hearing his parents say they loved him. He didn't want grand gestures, he only wanted to feel cared for. He walked back to his room, passing the decorated hallways that meant nothing to him. He sat on his bed, staring at the floor, thinking about the years that had passed without change. He wondered if his parents even realized how much he struggled. He remembered the times he tried to talk but was ignored, the times he hoped they would notice he wasn't eating, and the times he wished someone would ask why he looked sad. But those moments never came. Ethan felt like a small figure lost inside a world too big and too cold for him. As Christmas night continued, he lay down and closed his eyes, hoping that maybe someday things would change. But deep down, he knew that this Christmas, like all the others, would end with the same heavy silence surrounding him. Grace Thompson arrived at the mansion with the intention of doing her job well, but she quickly felt the coldness in the air, a type of coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. On her first morning, she quietly cleaned the main hallway, trying not to disturb anyone. While she moved her cleaning supplies, she noticed a small figure sitting alone at the top of the stairs. Ethan was there, hugging his knees and staring at nothing. His posture showed sadness, even though he didn't say a word. Grace paused for a moment, unsure if she should approach, but something about the boy made her feel that he needed more than silence around him. She walked up slowly, careful not to frighten him. When she reached the top, she gave him a gentle smile and asked if he wanted company. Ethan didn't speak, he only nodded lightly. That small gesture was enough for her to sit near him, not too close but close enough to show that he wasn't alone. She didn't ask anything else at first. She simply stayed there, letting him know someone was willing to sit beside him without expecting anything in return. Later that day, Grace went to the kitchen and tried to think of something simple to prepare for Ethan. She had noticed earlier that he looked weak, and she wondered if he had been eating well. She put together a small plate with plain food, nothing too heavy or complicated. When she found him again, she gently placed the plate in front of him and asked if he wanted to try a little. Ethan looked at the food but didn't touch it. His eyes showed a quiet sadness, one that didn't need loud words to be understood. Grace didn't pressure him or insist that he eat. Instead, she sat down near him again, giving him space, but also showing she wasn't going anywhere. She paid attention to how he reacted, noticing the way he lowered his gaze whenever he felt uncomfortable. She could see he wasn't rejecting the food out of stubbornness, but out of something deeper that she couldn't yet understand. Still, she stayed there calmly, hoping that her presence alone could make things feel a little less heavy for him. As the afternoon went on, Grace tried to start a simple conversation with Ethan. She asked small questions, nothing serious, just things like whether he liked school or what subjects he enjoyed. At first, he didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the floor or looked at his hands. She didn't give up, but she also didn't push too hard. She knew forcing him to speak would only make him close himself even more. She kept her tone soft, trying to make him feel safe. Eventually, Ethan raised his eyes and gave her a short answer. It wasn't much, just a few words, but to her it felt like a small door opening. She smiled again, encouraging him without overwhelming him. When she asked about his toys, he responded with another short sentence. Grace could tell he was cautious, unsure if he could trust this new person in the house. But each reply, even if brief, showed he was beginning to feel a little more comfortable around her. She kept the conversation slow and gentle, letting him decide how much he wanted to say. Ethan wasn't used to having someone who paid attention to him. Every question Grace asked made him think carefully before speaking. He wasn't scared of her, but he wasn't confident either. He wasn't sure if talking would make things worse later, or if someone would tell him he shouldn't be wasting time with an employee. Still, something about Grace felt different from the adults he was used to. She didn't look distracted when he answered. She didn't look busy or bored. She looked patient. That alone made him feel a little safer. Grace noticed the way he looked at her, as if waiting for her to change and walk away like everyone else. But she stayed seated, steady and calm. She didn't rush him. She didn't look at her phone or hurry to another task. She gave him the rare feeling that his words mattered. So he told her another small detail about school. She nodded and listened, treating his words with importance. The afternoon passed slowly, but for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel completely invisible. Over time, the atmosphere between them began to shift in a gentle way. Grace could sense that Ethan was not ready for big conversations, but she also realized he wanted someone to notice him, even if he didn't know how to ask for it. She continued with simple questions, not to invade his life, but to show she cared. Ethan answered slowly, with pauses between each sentence, as if checking whether it was safe to continue. Grace respected every pause. She didn't fill the silence with unnecessary talking. She allowed him to think and breathe. She noticed how he sat a little less curled up, how his shoulders relaxed just a bit. He still didn't touch the food, but he didn't push it away either. For Grace, this small change showed trust starting to form. She knew it would take time before he felt comfortable enough to open up about his feelings, but she didn't mind. She understood that what he needed most was someone who wouldn't disappear the moment things got difficult or quiet. As the day came to an end, the connection between them had grown in a way neither of them expected. Ethan didn't smile, but he no longer seemed completely closed off. He spoke a little more, and though his words were simple, they meant a lot. He hadn't talked this much to anyone in a long time. Grace stayed near him until her work was done, making sure he didn't feel abandoned again. She didn't try to replace anything or anyone in his life. She simply wanted him to feel that at least one person saw him and cared enough to stay. When she finally stood up to leave for the evening, she told him she would be back the next day. Ethan didn't say anything, but he watched her leave with a quiet expression that showed he had noticed her effort. For a boy who was used to being alone, this small beginning felt like an unexpected change. Even if he didn't fully understand it yet, something new had started that afternoon, something gentle, simple, and important. As the days passed, Grace and Ethan fell into a routine that felt calm and safe for both of them. Every morning, when Grace started working, Ethan appeared quietly, as if he already knew where she would be. He did not say much, but he stayed close, watching her as she placed decorations around the house or organized the Christmas presents. Grace talked to him about simple things, like colors she liked, music she heard on the radio, or small memories from her day. She kept everything light, never asking anything that would make him uncomfortable. Ethan listened carefully, and sometimes he nodded or gave short answers. Little by little, he stopped hiding and started walking beside her from room to room. He followed her, not because he had to, but because being near her made him feel calmer. The mansion still felt big and empty, but when he walked next to Grace, it didn't feel as cold. She didn't treat him like a burden or like someone she needed to rush past. Instead, she treated him with patience, and Ethan absorbed every bit of attention she offered. During this time, Richard and Vanessa stayed completely focused on their own lives. Richard kept arriving late, always on the phone or thinking about work. He barely noticed anything happening in the house, and certainly didn't see how close Ethan had become to Grace. Vanessa continued planning trips and meetings, moving in and out of the mansion without paying attention to the quiet changes around her. Neither of them realized that the new employee was the only person giving their son the affection he had been missing for so long. They walked past him the same way they always had, never stopping to see that he wasn't alone anymore. Meanwhile, Grace did not take their place or try to act like more than she was, but she gave Ethan what they never did: presence. She talked to him, looked at him, and listened. The simple act of being noticed made Ethan cling even more to the moments he had with her. Grace soon realized that Ethan's eating habits were worse than she expected. He barely touched anything that the kitchen staff prepared. He would sit in front of full plates without lifting his spoon. He didn't complain, he simply showed no desire to eat. Grace watched him carefully and saw that he wasn't refusing food out of anger or stubbornness. He simply had no appetite. So she tried something different. Instead of large meals, she offered small, simple foods like soup with soft pieces of vegetables or slices of fruit. She didn't force him to eat. She just placed the food near him and stayed by his side. Over time, Ethan began to take tiny bites, especially when Grace was sitting close enough to make him feel less nervous. He ate slowly, sometimes only a few spoonfuls, but it was more than he ate with anyone else. Grace felt relieved each time he accepted even a small portion. She understood that earning his trust was part of helping him feel safe enough to open up, even in something as basic as eating. Ethan's behavior changed in small but meaningful ways. When Grace walked into a room, he appeared shortly after, moving quietly but with purpose. He stood near her while she worked, sometimes watching her hands as she fixed Christmas ornaments or arranged ribbons on gifts. He didn't talk a lot, yet he stayed close, as if her presence gave him a sense of security. Grace kept her movements slow and calm, knowing sudden changes might make him pull away. She continued talking about everyday topics, not expecting responses, but appreciating when he gave them. She noticed that his eyes followed her whenever she moved to another corner of the room, and without needing to ask, he walked after her. Their routine became natural, like something they both needed without realizing it at first. Grace saw that he trusted her more each day, and she handled that trust with care, never wanting to overwhelm him. For Ethan, each moment with her made the house feel less lonely. He started feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: comfort. As Christmas approached, the bond between Grace and Ethan grew stronger. She didn't try to change his life or take on responsibilities she wasn't meant to, but she paid attention to what he needed, something no one else had done in years. She noticed the way he looked around before eating, making sure she was near. She noticed how he relaxed slightly when she sat on the floor next to him, or when she spoke softly about simple things. She understood that his silence wasn't rejection. It was fear mixed with years of being ignored. She respected that silence and let him communicate in his own way. Ethan, on the other hand, felt something new, the feeling that someone genuinely cared about him. He didn't have the words to describe it, but he felt safer when she was around. He didn't follow her because he needed help. He followed her because she made him feel seen. Their connection wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and built from small, meaningful moments. By the end of those days, it was clear that the relationship between Grace and Ethan had turned into something important for both of them. Grace discovered how deep Ethan's loneliness really was. She understood that he wasn't just a shy boy, he was a child who had been missing attention and affection for far too long. And Ethan recognized something in Grace that he had never experienced from the adults in his home: care that wasn't forced, rushed, or fake. He didn't smile often, but he stayed close to her without hesitation. He ate small portions when she encouraged him gently. He spoke more than he used to, even if only in short sentences. Their connection did not come from grand gestures, but from the quiet way Grace stayed by his side, and the quiet way Ethan leaned toward her presence. In those days, without anyone else in the mansion noticing, something fragile and meaningful grew between them. A simple bond that made Ethan feel less invisible and made Grace understand how much he needed someone to stay. On Christmas Eve, the house looked bright from the outside, with lights hanging around the windows and garlands placed along the railings. But even with all the decorations, the inside still felt empty to Ethan. He walked through the halls slowly, noticing the shiny ornaments but feeling no excitement. The mansion felt the same as every other day: quiet, cold, and too big for one child to feel comfortable in. Grace understood that the decorations were not enough to change how he felt, so she decided to prepare a special meal, hoping it might bring him a small sense of warmth. She didn't choose anything complicated, just something she thought he might accept. She called him softly and asked if he wanted to help her set the table. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. This simple invitation made him feel included, something rare for him. He followed her into the dining room, watching as she laid out the plates and utensils. Even though the house looked festive, Grace could tell that Ethan needed more than lights and ornaments to feel better. She wanted to make the evening different from the usual silence he was used to. As they worked together, the atmosphere slowly changed. Grace handed him napkins and showed him where to place them. When she accidentally dropped one on the floor, Ethan let out a small laugh, quiet but genuine. Grace laughed too, not loudly but warmly, and she joked lightly about being clumsy. That made Ethan relax even more. He then tried arranging the silverware, but he mixed up the order, placing a fork where a spoon should go. Grace didn't correct him in a strict way. Instead, she smiled and gently guided him, turning the mistake into something fun. They shared a few more quiet laughs, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because working together made the task feel pleasant instead of lonely. For the first time in a long while, Ethan wasn't tense or withdrawn. His shoulders loosened and his face softened. He didn't speak much, but his small reactions showed that he felt safe. Grace noticed this and continued talking to him about simple things, hoping the mood would stay light and peaceful as they finished the table. As the afternoon continued, Ethan stayed close to Grace, helping her place small items on the table. He didn't rush or hide his hands like he normally did. He took his time and seemed comfortable performing even simple tasks. Grace watched him carefully, noticing how different he looked compared to the first days she met him. He wasn't curled up or silent in fear. He was calm, focused, and responding to her presence with trust. Every time she gave him something to hold, he accepted it without hesitation. Every time she made a small comment, he listened with interest. The mansion felt slightly less gloomy because of the quiet moments they shared. Grace understood these moments mattered to him. She didn't try to turn the afternoon into anything more than it was. She simply stayed beside him, offering kindness through small actions and gentle words. For Ethan, these moments were enough to feel a change inside himself. He didn't fully understand it, but he felt lighter, as if someone had lifted a weight off his chest. In that decorated room, he finally felt a bit of peace. Later in the day, Richard arrived at the mansion. He entered quickly, walking through the front hall with his usual hurried steps. He had come only to change his clothes before leaving for another important event. His mind was focused on his schedule, not on his surroundings. As he crossed the hallway, he passed by the dining room where Ethan and Grace were finishing the decorations. The warm scene between them, the small laughs, the teamwork, the gentle atmosphere, was happening right before his eyes, yet he didn't notice. He didn't turn his head or pause. He walked straight across the room, speaking briefly on his phone, and then disappeared up the stairs, completely unaware of what was happening just a few feet away. To him, the house was only a place to stop for a moment, not a home where something meaningful was taking place. Ethan saw him pass, but didn't react much. It wasn't unusual for his father not to notice him. Grace also saw Richard walk by, but she kept the calm environment steady, making sure Ethan didn't lose the comfort he had gained that afternoon. While Richard rushed through the house, Vanessa wasn't anywhere near the mansion. She was busy attending a luxury party, surrounded by people, music, and loud conversations. She didn't come home to see the decorations or check how Ethan was doing on Christmas Eve. She didn't know he was setting the table, or that, for the first time in a long time, he had laughed with someone. Her absence was nothing new, but on such an important night, it became even more noticeable. The bright lights outside the house made it look cheerful, but inside, the lack of parental attention left a strong emptiness. Grace, however, stayed focused on Ethan. She didn't try to replace his parents, but she gave him something real: patience, kindness, and presence. Those simple things filled a part of the quiet space that Richard and Vanessa left behind. Ethan might not have understood why his parents were never around, but he could clearly feel the difference between their distance and Grace's gentle care. As the evening approached, the contrast in the house became clearer. The decorations sparkled, the table looked ready for a celebration, and the rooms were filled with soft Christmas colors. But the warmth in the house didn't come from the lights or the ornaments. It came from the moments Ethan shared with Grace. She was the only one who tried to make the night special for him. The absence of his parents didn't surprise him anymore, but having someone who stayed by his side made this Christmas Eve different from the others. Ethan felt calmer than he had in years. He still didn't smile widely, but his eyes showed signs of comfort and trust. Grace noticed every small change and understood how much it meant. She didn't need grand gestures to make the night meaningful. Her presence alone was enough to show Ethan that he wasn't completely alone in the large, quiet mansion. And even though the house looked festive, it was clear that the true warmth of the night came from the connection between the boy and the woman who cared about him when no one else did. On Christmas morning, Ethan woke up feeling the same heaviness he felt every year. Even though the living room was filled with wrapped presents of different sizes and bright colors, none of them made him feel excited. He walked slowly toward the sofa and sat down, staring at the gifts without touching them. The house was quiet, too quiet for such a special day, and that silence only made him feel more alone. Grace entered the room a few minutes later and immediately noticed that something was wrong. She could see it in his expression, in the way he kept his shoulders lowered, and in the way his eyes looked tired. She approached him gently, not wanting to overwhelm him. She sat beside him and leaned slightly forward, giving him space, but also showing that she cared. She asked him softly if something was bothering him. Ethan didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the floor, as if he wasn't sure he should speak. Grace didn't rush him. She waited patiently, hoping he would trust her enough to explain what he was feeling on a day that was supposed to be joyful. After a long moment of silence, Ethan finally opened up. His voice was quiet and unsteady, as if the words were difficult for him to say. He told Grace that he didn't understand why his mother never stayed with him, not even on important days like Christmas. He also said he didn't know why his father acted as if he didn't matter. Each word carried years of confusion and pain, and Grace felt her heart tighten as she listened. She knew Ethan was not exaggerating or trying to get attention. He was simply expressing a sadness he had kept inside for far too long. Grace nodded gently, letting him know she was listening to every word. She didn't interrupt or try to explain his parents' actions. She understood that what he needed in that moment was not an excuse, but someone who genuinely cared about what he felt. Ethan looked up at her with eyes full of hurt, waiting to see if she judged him or brushed off his feelings. But Grace stayed quiet, offering him calm and understanding through her presence. Then unexpectedly, Ethan made a request that took Grace by surprise. With a shaky voice, he asked if she could be his mother just for one day. He explained that he wanted her to be his mother only for that Christmas, nothing more. His words were simple, but they carried such deep longing that Grace felt overwhelmed. She hadn't expected him to ask something like that. She knew he didn't want gifts or big surprises. He wanted something much more meaningful. He wanted to feel what it was like to have someone stay by his side with affection. Grace felt emotional, but she tried to hide it so he wouldn't feel guilty or embarrassed. She smiled softly and told him yes. She told him she would be whatever he needed for that day. She saw a small change in his expression. Nothing dramatic, but enough to show that her answer had brought him a bit of comfort. She knew she couldn't replace what he lacked permanently, but she could at least give him a moment of warmth on a day that should have been special. Grace took a slow breath, trying to recover from the impact of his request. She didn't want Ethan to see how deeply his words had affected her. She placed a gentle hand near him, careful not to overwhelm him, and reassured him again that she would stay close to him all day. She wanted him to know that he wasn't asking for too much. For Ethan, this meant more than any present under the tree. He felt a small sense of relief, as if a heavy weight had shifted slightly. The idea of having someone act like a mother for even one day made the morning feel less empty. Grace kept her voice calm and warm, telling him that they could spend Christmas together and that he could talk to her or sit beside her whenever he needed. She didn't promise anything unrealistic. She simply offered herself with the same kindness she had been showing since the day they met. For the first time that day, Ethan's breathing steadied, and he looked at her with quiet gratitude, finally feeling understood. What Ethan didn't know was that someone else had heard everything. Richard had returned earlier than planned and was walking down the hallway when he heard the soft sound of their voices. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the silence in the house made their words echo slightly. He stopped walking when he heard Ethan mention his mother and father. As he listened, Richard felt something he wasn't prepared for. When Ethan asked Grace to be his mother for one day, Richard felt his chest tighten in a way that was unfamiliar to him. He had always focused on work, believing that providing money and a comfortable life was enough. But hearing his son's pain directly, spoken in such a small and honest voice, shook him deeply. He stood still in the corridor, unable to move, replaying Ethan's words in his mind. He realized that his son felt alone, not because of the house or the lack of gifts, but because of the distance he himself had created. As Richard remained in the hallway, hidden from sight, he experienced a kind of discomfort he had never allowed himself to feel before. He understood, even if only in that brief moment, that he had failed to give Ethan the attention and affection he needed. He didn't step into the room or make his presence known. He simply stood there quietly, listening to Grace's calm response and Ethan's shaky voice. The scene made him feel something he hadn't felt in years, a mix of guilt, regret, and fear. He realized that his son had turned to a stranger for the comfort he should have provided. Ethan had asked someone else for what he had always wanted from his own parents. Richard didn't know what to do or say, so he stayed hidden, unable to face them yet. For the rest of that moment, he remained still, listening to the sounds of a connection he had never taken the time to build. Richard stood still in the hallway, trying to fully understand the conversation he had just heard. He had not planned to stop, but Ethan's voice had frozen him in place. Now, as he watched quietly, he felt something he was not used to feeling. Grace was sitting beside Ethan, speaking softly, guiding him with patience and kindness. Richard noticed the way she leaned toward the boy with care, as if every small action mattered. He saw Ethan's shoulders relax in her presence, something he rarely saw when he was around. He also noticed how gently she encouraged him to take a few bites from the small plate the kitchen staff had prepared. To Richard, it felt strange to stand there and witness a level of affection that he himself had never managed to offer. He remained hidden, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know how to step forward. He was unsure if he even deserved to interrupt such a tender moment between them. As he continued watching, Richard saw something that surprised him deeply. Ethan lifted a small piece of chicken and brought it slowly to his mouth. It seemed like a simple action, but for a boy who had refused food for so long, it was a meaningful change. Grace didn't celebrate loudly or draw attention to it. She only smiled softly, encouraging him with a warm expression that showed how proud she was. Richard noticed the way Ethan looked at her before taking the next bite, as if seeking permission or comfort. It struck Richard how different this scene was from the life he believed he had built for his son. He had always thought that providing the best house, the best toys, and the best school was enough. But watching Ethan now, he realized none of those things mattered if the boy didn't have someone who made him feel cared for. That simple moment, the boy eating because Grace was by his side, hit him harder than any business failure ever could. A little later, Grace stood up and wiped her hands gently before inviting Ethan to join her in the living room. She told him she had a few presents for him, nothing fancy, just things she had chosen with affection. Ethan followed her quietly, showing a small curiosity he rarely displayed. Richard moved slightly to the side, staying hidden as they entered the room. Grace picked up a few small boxes, wrapped in simple paper, and placed them in front of Ethan. She explained that she had wrapped them herself and hoped he would like them. Ethan hesitated at first, as if unsure what to do, but then he slowly reached for the first package. He opened it carefully, taking his time with each fold of the paper. Inside, he found a small teddy bear. His face changed in a subtle but noticeable way. His eyes softened, and the corner of his mouth lifted in a slight smile. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real, and it showed how much the gift meant to him. Grace seemed surprised but happy when she saw his reaction. She had chosen the teddy bear because she thought he might feel comfort holding something soft and simple. She didn't expect such a strong response, even if it was quiet. Ethan held the teddy bear gently, pressing it against his chest as if it was something precious. He whispered a small, "Thank you," and even though his voice was low, Grace heard it clearly. She sat next to him, explaining why she had picked each gift, and hoping he understood that they came from genuine care rather than obligation. Ethan listened carefully, nodding slightly as she spoke. The boy, who rarely showed emotions, now seemed willing to let a bit of happiness in. He didn't hide his feelings behind silence or fear. Instead, he let himself enjoy the moment, even if he didn't know how long it would last. The soft connection between them filled the room with a warmth the mansion had never truly known. From where he stood, Richard watched everything unfold, and the scene struck him harder than any argument or criticism he had ever faced. He saw his son, who barely ate and rarely smiled, reacting with quiet joy because of a simple teddy bear chosen by the housekeeper. He realized that Ethan wasn't asking for luxuries or impossible things. He wasn't waiting for expensive gifts or grand gestures. He had only wanted affection, presence, and someone who looked at him with kindness. Richard felt a heavy pressure in his chest as the truth sank in. Grace had managed to reach Ethan in ways he never had. She had done more in a few weeks than he had done in years. The guilt he felt wasn't something he could push away. It grew inside him, making him question every choice he had made as a father. As he continued watching, the guilt deepened. Richard understood that he had been absent for too long, convincing himself that providing financial comfort was enough. But the sight of Ethan holding the teddy bear, showing a rare smile, made him realize just how wrong he had been. It wasn't the expensive toys he had given Ethan that mattered. It was the quiet attention, the gentle words, and the small moments of connection that Grace gave so naturally. Richard felt overwhelmed by the awareness that he had failed to see what his son truly needed. He stayed hidden, not because he wanted to ignore the situation, but because he didn't yet know how to face it. He felt the weight of his mistakes more clearly than ever. As he stood there, watching Ethan lean closer to Grace with trust, Richard knew he had allowed distance to grow between them. And now, for the first time, he couldn't ignore the painful reality of what his absence had cost. Richard stayed hidden for a moment longer, trying to understand everything he had just witnessed. He felt confused, guilty, and strangely hopeful. Instead of walking away, he chose to keep watching, wanting to see more of how Grace interacted with Ethan. When lunchtime arrived, it wasn't a planned meal, just something simple prepared quickly in the kitchen. Grace sat with Ethan at the table and patiently showed him how to cut a small piece of food. She held the fork and knife slowly, demonstrating each movement so he wouldn't feel pressured. Ethan watched carefully, copying her movements with effort. He cut a small piece, looked at her for approval, and then brought it to his mouth. Richard felt another wave of surprise wash over him. Ethan never behaved like this when he was around. The boy usually pushed food aside or pretended he wasn't hungry, but with Grace, he was trying. He was eating because she made him feel safe. Every time Ethan took a bite, Grace gave him a small smile, and he seemed to relax even more. To Richard, it was like watching a part of his son he had never known existed. As the meal continued, Richard took notice of every detail. Ethan did not complain, look away, or push anything off the plate. Instead, he tasted everything Grace offered him, even the foods he normally avoided. Grace encouraged him gently, never raising her voice or showing any frustration. She talked to him calmly and waited patiently for him to respond. Richard could see that Ethan trusted her completely. This trust wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, built through many small moments. Richard felt uncomfortable as he realized that he had never earned that same kind of trust from his son. He had always assumed Ethan would simply grow into the life he provided. But now he could see how wrong he had been. The change in Ethan's behavior wasn't about the food. It was about the person who was sitting beside him. Grace made everything feel less overwhelming for the boy, and Ethan's reactions showed just how important she had become in his life. When Vanessa finally arrived at the mansion, the peaceful moment shifted abruptly. She entered the dining area with a frustrated expression, complaining loudly about a party she had missed. Her irritation filled the room immediately. She didn't greet Ethan or ask what he was doing. She didn't notice how carefully he had been eating or how close he was sitting to Grace. Instead, her eyes went straight to the table, and she frowned at the simple lunch. She complained that the food looked plain, that the table wasn't arranged properly, and that the house felt messy. Her words came out quickly, sharp and impatient. Ethan's shoulders tensed the moment she spoke. He drew back from the table and lowered his head, as if trying to make himself smaller. Richard felt his stomach twist as he watched this small reaction. Vanessa continued talking, never once glancing at her son. She behaved as if he wasn't even in the room. Grace didn't let Vanessa's attitude disturb her calm. She continued speaking to Ethan in a soft tone, trying to keep the environment stable for him. She gently encouraged him to finish the last small bite on his plate, pretending not to notice Vanessa's irritation. But Ethan clearly felt the tension. His body curled slightly, his hands became still, and the comfort he had shown earlier faded quickly. Grace placed a hand near him, not touching him directly, but close enough to reassure him without making things worse. She stayed composed, creating a buffer between him and the stress in the room. Richard saw everything from where he stood. He noticed how Ethan reacted to each harsh word from Vanessa, and how he leaned instinctively toward Grace for security. The contrast was sharp and painful to watch. For the first time, Richard saw the situation clearly. He understood now that Ethan wasn't simply quiet or distant by nature. His behavior was shaped by the lack of attention and affection he received from the people who should have cared for him the most. Vanessa's coldness had become normal in the house, and Richard himself had been no different. He had spent years thinking that providing money and comfort was enough. But now he could see that it wasn't even close. He watched his wife ignore their child without hesitation, while the employee they barely noticed treated Ethan with more kindness than either of them ever had. The contrast between the two women struck him deeply. One offered love through small, patient actions. The other didn't offer anything at all. The realization hit Richard harder than he expected. He felt a weight in his chest that he couldn't push away. Watching Ethan shrink under Vanessa's complaints and then lean toward Grace for comfort showed him a truth he could no longer avoid. His son found more affection in the presence of a hired worker than in his own parents. This thought broke something inside him. He realized he had neglected Ethan far more than he had ever admitted. The guilt was impossible to ignore now. He had failed to protect his son from loneliness, failed to show him love, and failed to notice how much he needed simple affection. As he stood there, Richard finally understood the damage his absence had caused, and for the first time in many years, he didn't try to excuse it. He simply felt it, fully, painfully, and completely. Richard remained quiet for a long time after watching Vanessa ignore Ethan so easily. The scene stayed in his mind, repeating again and again. He thought about all the years he had spent focused on work, money, and success, believing that giving his family everything they wanted was enough. But now, standing in his own house, he realized he had not given Ethan the one thing the boy needed the most: attention. He felt as if he was seeing his life from the outside for the first time. He remembered the many nights he came home late, the mornings he left before Ethan woke up, and the countless moments when he walked past his son without stopping to ask if he was okay. All those choices suddenly seemed heavy and wrong. He had believed he was doing things for the family, but the truth was that his choices had pushed Ethan into loneliness. Feeling overwhelmed, Richard decided he couldn't ignore this any longer. He needed to understand exactly how bad things were when he wasn't around. Trying to stay calm, Richard called Grace aside quietly when Ethan wasn't paying attention. He didn't want to scare her or make her think she was in trouble. His tone was gentle, something he wasn't used to using with employees. He asked her directly how Ethan behaved when he and Vanessa were not present. Grace hesitated for a second, unsure if she should reveal everything, but the seriousness in Richard's expression showed her that he truly wanted to know. So she explained what she had seen since the day she arrived. She told him about Ethan's difficulty with food, how he rarely ate unless someone was patient with him. She described his sadness, the long periods of silence, and the way he walked around the house as if he were invisible. She also mentioned how he often sat alone, how he didn't talk about his parents, and how he reacted to the smallest bit of kindness. Grace didn't exaggerate anything. She simply told the truth, softly but clearly, hoping Richard would finally understand the reality his son lived in every day. As Richard listened, he felt something inside him sink. Each word Grace said felt like a blow he couldn't defend himself against. Hearing that Ethan barely ate was painful enough, but discovering that the boy lived with constant sadness made him feel devastated. He knew Ethan wasn't an expressive child, but he had never imagined the problem was this deep. Grace's description of Ethan's loneliness made Richard feel ashamed. The years he had spent chasing financial success now felt meaningless. What was the point of wealth if his own son felt abandoned in a house full of luxury? Every detail Grace shared pushed him further into remorse, showing him how disconnected he had been from the person who needed him the most. When she described how Ethan reacted to small bits of attention, Richard realized that the boy wasn't asking for much. He didn't need expensive gifts or special trips. He needed love, presence, and someone who made him feel important. This realization broke something in Richard. He had thought he was providing everything, but he now understood he had provided nothing that truly mattered. When Grace finished speaking, Richard didn't try to defend himself or justify his past choices. He lowered his head for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of everything he had ignored for years. Then he quietly thanked her. His voice was sincere, almost emotional. He thanked her not only for telling him the truth, but for taking care of Ethan when he himself had failed to do so. He told her he was grateful for her patience, her dedication, and the way she had treated Ethan with kindness. He asked her, almost pleading, to stay close to the boy for the rest of the day. He didn't know how to fix everything yet, and he wasn't sure if Ethan was ready for him to step in. But he wanted Grace to remain near him, to give him the comfort he clearly needed. She nodded softly, promising she would stay with Ethan and continue supporting him. Richard felt a small sense of relief, knowing she would be there, even though the guilt in his chest remained strong and painful. While all this was happening, Vanessa left the house again. She claimed she had urgent appointments, though Richard knew those appointments were only parties or social events she didn't want to miss. She walked out without checking on Ethan, without asking what was happening, and without noticing the emotional chaos in her own home. Her absence did not surprise Richard. It only made him feel even more guilty for letting her behavior continue for so long. Meanwhile, Ethan was completely unaware of the serious conversation that had taken place between the adults. He sat on the floor of the living room, holding the small teddy bear Grace had given him. The bear was simple and soft, nothing expensive or extravagant, but Ethan held it with a tenderness that showed how much it meant to him. He pressed it against his chest, moving its little arms as if it were a companion. His expression was calm, almost peaceful, something rare for him. The expensive toys scattered around the room didn't interest him at all. The only object he wanted near him was the teddy bear Grace had chosen with care. Ethan continued playing with the teddy bear, showing more affection toward that small gift than he had ever shown toward the expensive presents his parents bought him over the years. He didn't care about shiny boxes or toys that made noise. He cared about the feeling behind the gift. Grace had chosen it for him, thinking about what might make him feel safe and happy, and Ethan felt that. He hugged the bear tightly, sometimes placing it beside him as if it were a friend sitting next to him. Richard watched from a distance, deeply affected by the sight. The contrast between the simple teddy bear and the luxurious environment made everything clearer. Ethan didn't need anything grand. He needed love. The kind of love he had been denied for far too long. Seeing him attached so strongly to a simple gift made Richard understand how little affection the boy had received. In that quiet moment, Richard realized just how much he needed to change if he wanted to be the father Ethan deserved. Richard spent the rest of the day thinking about everything he had learned and everything he had ignored for so long. He knew he could not erase the past, but he felt a strong need to do something meaningful before the Christmas night ended. He wanted to show Ethan that he was ready to change, not with expensive gifts or sudden promises, but with a real gesture he had never made before. After hours of reflecting, he decided to prepare a surprise for his son, a surprise that did not involve money or luxury, but effort from his own hands. He gathered all the employees and asked them to help make the mansion feel warm and welcoming. He told them he was cancelling all of his important commitments for the evening, something that shocked everyone, since Richard had never cancelled anything for personal reasons. The staff quickly worked together, dimming bright lights, setting up the dining area, and arranging things in a way that felt calm and inviting. When everything was ready, Richard took a deep breath and asked Grace to bring Ethan to the main living room. Grace went to find Ethan, who was still sitting quietly with his teddy bear. She told him his father wanted to show him something, but she didn't explain what it was. Ethan looked unsure at first, but he trusted Grace enough to follow her. As they walked through the hallway, he held the teddy bear close to his chest, as if it could give him courage. When they reached the main room, Ethan stopped and stared. The room looked different from how it had earlier. The lights were softer, and the big dining table was set in a simple but thoughtful way. There were no extravagant decorations, no overly fancy dishes, just a warm, quiet atmosphere. At the center of the table were a few plates of basic food, clearly prepared by someone without much experience. Richard stood beside the table, looking nervous, unsure of how Ethan would react. The surprise made Grace pause as well, not expecting Richard to take such a personal step. For a long moment, the room was completely silent as Ethan tried to understand what he was seeing. Then Richard stepped forward and spoke to his son with a tone Ethan had rarely heard from him. He admitted he had made many mistakes and told Ethan he had not been the father the boy deserved. His voice wasn't rehearsed or polished like during business meetings. It was honest, shaky, and full of regret. He explained that he had spent too many years focused on work and had let distance grow between them. Richard told Ethan he wanted to change that, starting tonight. He said the food he made might not be perfect, but he hoped they could sit together and try to share a meal. Grace watched the scene quietly, moved by the sincerity in Richard's words. She could see how difficult it was for Richard to open up, and she could also see how confused, but touched, Ethan looked. The boy didn't speak right away. Instead, he clutched his teddy bear tightly and looked up at his father, searching for any sign that this moment was real. Ethan finally took a small step toward the table. His hands were trembling slightly, but his eyes were focused on the food Richard had prepared. It wasn't fancy or impressive, but it was made with effort, and that meant something. Richard pulled out a chair for him, not in a formal way, but with genuine care. Ethan sat down slowly, still unsure of what to expect. Richard took a seat beside him, staying close, but not overwhelming him. Grace stood by the doorway, giving them space but ready to step in if Ethan became uncomfortable. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Richard simply waited, allowing Ethan to decide what to do next. Ethan lifted his fork with hesitation, glancing at his father again for reassurance. Richard nodded gently, encouraging him without using words. With a deep breath, Ethan took a small bite of the food. It wasn't perfect, but he didn't push it away. He swallowed slowly, then looked at his father again with eyes full of emotion. Seeing Ethan eat the food he had prepared made Richard feel something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. It wasn't a loud or dramatic moment. It was a quiet beginning, but it was real. Ethan didn't suddenly smile or speak excitedly. Instead, he took another small bite, showing that he was willing to try. For Richard, that was more meaningful than anything else. Grace watched from a distance, amazed at how far Ethan had come and how sincerely Richard was trying to connect with him. She could see the beginning of something important forming between father and son. Richard didn't rush the moment. He simply stayed beside Ethan, allowing the boy to eat at his own pace. Ethan continued to take slow bites, holding the teddy bear with one hand and the fork with the other. It was an imperfect scene, but it was filled with genuine emotion. As the simple meal continued, something subtle but powerful began to happen. Ethan leaned slightly closer to his father, not in a dramatic way, but enough to show that he was accepting the moment. Richard's eyes softened, and he placed his hand gently on the table near Ethan, not touching him, but offering silent support. Ethan didn't pull away. Instead, he kept eating, showing a small but sincere willingness to reconnect. Grace felt a deep sense of relief watching them. She knew this didn't erase years of distance, but it was a real start, something Ethan had needed for a long time. When the meal finally came to an end, Ethan looked up at his father with a quiet expression that held both vulnerability and trust. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a beginning. A beginning built on honesty, effort, and a desire to finally be a real family. Richard sat quietly beside Ethan for a while, letting the peaceful moment settle between them. When the room felt calm again, he turned to his son with a gentle expression that Ethan wasn't used to seeing. He told Ethan that he wanted Grace to continue working with them, not only as an employee, but as an important part of their lives. He explained that she had helped him see things he had ignored for too long, and that she had become someone essential in Ethan's day-to-day life. Ethan listened with wide eyes, holding his teddy bear tightly, as if the idea made him feel both surprised and relieved. Grace, who had stayed near the doorway to give them privacy, felt her heart warm when she heard Richard's words. She wasn't expecting such a proposal, but seeing how much Ethan depended on her made the decision feel natural. When Richard asked if she would stay, she accepted softly, promising that she would always do her best to care for Ethan and support him through whatever came next. Her voice was steady, but her eyes showed how moved she was by the trust they both placed in her. Vanessa entered soon afterward and immediately noticed the change in the atmosphere. The room felt different, warmer, calmer, and filled with a closeness that had never been there before. When she saw Richard standing beside Ethan and Grace, she understood right away that something had shifted, and not in her favor. She tried to approach with an irritated tone, questioning what was happening and why decisions were being made without her. She raised her voice, insisting that she was still the mother and that she should have control over what went on in the house. But Richard, who had spent the entire day reflecting on his past mistakes, did not respond the way he normally would. Instead of arguing or backing down, he calmly told her that things needed to be different from now on. He explained that he would no longer ignore Ethan's feelings or allow the boy to be pushed aside. If Vanessa wanted a place in their lives, she needed to change her behavior, starting with how she treated their son. Vanessa's expression tightened, clearly offended, but Richard didn't waver. He had made up his mind. Ethan watched the exchange without fully understanding all the details, but he sensed that something serious was happening. He looked from his father to Grace, noticing how calm they remained, even while Vanessa grew frustrated. For the first time, he didn't feel scared when adults argued. Instead, he felt protected, knowing that his father wasn't going to walk away or disappear into another room. Richard's calm tone and steady presence made Ethan feel safer than he had in years. When Vanessa eventually left the room in frustration, Ethan didn't feel guilty or confused. He simply leaned slightly toward his father, and Richard placed a hand near him on the table, not touching him directly, but close enough to show he was there. Grace remained nearby, ready to help if Ethan needed reassurance. The tension faded as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a quiet, warm silence. As the evening went on, the three of them stayed together. Grace brought out small pieces of dessert, simple treats she had prepared, and encouraged Ethan to try them. He tasted a tiny spoonful, made a funny face, and then giggled quietly when Richard pretended to be shocked at how sweet it was. Grace laughed softly too, happy to see Ethan enjoying himself. This was the first time Ethan had laughed like that in a long while, the kind of laugh that came naturally instead of being forced. He moved between Grace and his father, comfortable with both of them, as if he finally felt he belonged somewhere. Richard didn't take his eyes off his son for long, watching each reaction carefully, amazed at how lively Ethan seemed when surrounded by genuine care. The mansion, which had been silent and cold for years, now felt different. It was still large and full of expensive items, but the warmth in the room came from something much simpler: affection. For the rest of the night, Ethan stayed close to the two people who had shown him more kindness in one day than he had received in years. He tried different pieces of dessert, laughed at small things, and even rested his head lightly on Grace's arm at one point. Richard saw it and felt a mix of gratitude and regret, but mostly hope. The bond forming between the three of them wasn't forced. It came naturally, growing from honesty, care, and a willingness to change. Grace continued speaking gently, encouraging Ethan without pushing him. Richard added small comments now and then, testing his ability to talk to his son in a way he never had before. Ethan responded to both of them, shy but engaged, as if his heart was finally opening after years of being closed. By the time the night ended, the mansion felt almost unrecognizable. The coldness that had defined it for so long seemed to have faded, replaced by a sense of comfort that made everything feel softer. Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time: security. He knew he wasn't alone anymore. He knew that someone cared for him, and someone else was finally trying. As he held his teddy bear and sat between Grace and his father, he felt safe in a way that warmed his chest. The transformation in Richard wasn't small. It was surprising, powerful, and visible to everyone. Grace, the staff, and even Ethan sensed the difference. That Christmas night marked a turning point none of them had expected. And for Ethan, it became the first moment in years where he felt truly protected. Something simple, but more valuable than anything money could buy. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.